Well, for more on climate change priorities going into 2019, let's welcome Timmons Roberts live from Providence, Rhode Island. He's a professor of environmental studies and sociology at Brown University. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rachelle. Good to be on your show.
Now, obviously, the Paris Climate Accord was a momentous occasion, but which countries are really taking the lead in 2019 in trying to advance the Paris Accord?
So there's two parts for that question. I think there's the part of diplomacy, that is who's pushing the sort of global effort forward and trying to get global agreement on the issue. And I would say on that there are, when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated in 2015, there was great leadership from France, from Peru, the previous host of the UN negotiations. But there was this great joint agreement that was announced by China and the United States, setting their own targets for emissions reductions, which was really seen as sort of breaking a logjam in the negotiations. So I think back at that time, it really was the United States and China. In the last negotiations in Poland, just concluded last month, there was a tough time again as they were trying to turn that into actual a rule book called the Paris Rule Book. And it's been difficult. The negotiations are difficult, and without the leadership of the United States, which is of course the country that has put the most greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are the most responsible in the world. Right. China is of course now the largest emitter. We need these two countries really to step forward on the diplomacy side. I would say there is sort of, yeah, go ahead.
So given that, obviously, as you mentioned, there have been several government changes since 2015 when the accord was signed. The US saying it's pulling out. We have Brazil's new president saying he's a climate change skeptic. What are some of the misconceptions about withdrawing from these commitments?
So in the US, one of the misconceptions was that Trump could withdraw immediately. Of course, the way it was set up was that it took 4 years for the US to get out. So there's a very interesting bit of timing where the first day that the United States can formally withdraw from the Paris Agreement is on the day after the election in 2020, when Trump will either be reelected or not reelected. And so if we had a real change of government, then in fact, that incoming president could say, just hang on, we'll be right back. So in fact, the United States is still attending the negotiations, sending negotiating delegations, but they are not really in a leadership position anymore. And I think it has made it quite a bit tougher on the world. I was going to say, there's another side to this issue, of course, which is on actually who's doing much about climate change back home. We can talk in international fora about what we plan to do or what we should be doing, and there are countries that are much more cooperative on that. But then if you look at the countries that are really doing a lot, that are sort of taking actions in line with what the science is telling us is needed, and your reporter, Dan Williams, did a very nice little report there about what the science is saying, that things are quite dire. And if we do take rapid action, we can make a big difference in our future. That is, in what kind of, whether the effects are manageable or just entirely unmanageable. And the countries that are doing well are ones like Morocco, the Gambia, Bhutan, Costa Rica, Ethiopia. The countries that are doing the worst in the world are the Russian Federation, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the United States, and the Ukraine. Unfortunately, China is also in one of the groups whose actions that are proposed are highly insufficient. They're not as bad as the 5 that I just mentioned.
Now, Timmons, I do want to get to some of these other issues. In terms of some of these non-governmental agencies and private organizations, what can they do to try and offset some of these decisions by governments who choose not to actually have official legislation about climate change?
Right. So in the United States, what's happened is that cities and states are starting to step up. They're saying as loudly as they can to the world that we are still in the Paris Agreement. We are taking enough action that we will essentially do what the U.S. promised, which was back in Paris to say that we would reduce our emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025. Now, can we do this without the federal government acting? It's going to be very tough. And again, the science is now telling us that we need to get to net zero emissions by 2040 or 2050, which seems very far indeed from the actions that are taking place in the United States. So I think these states and cities actually can do very bold things. Some are making promises, like California made a pledge to get to net carbon free by 2045. And what they've said is we can do that with renewable energy, with some nuclear power, with biofuels, and with reforestation and other ways of absorbing some carbon back to the atmosphere. These are important, very important steps. They need to be made binding, in my opinion, or they are just pledges, and when things get tough, when people's attention is brought to other issues,
right,
then they will fall to the wayside. So these need to be really national, and they need to be more binding targets.
Now, obviously, we hear a lot about where this could go in terms of the survival of coral reefs, marine life, the extinction of animals and plants, even with just the smallest rise in temperatures. So given the severity of this and how hard it could be for us to wrap our heads around it, how much is that disconnect between reality and the future? How much of an impact is that having on the ability to actually have people pay more attention and be less, I guess, less passive about this issue?
Yes, this is a huge issue, and I'm a sociologist, and I think it's been a quite understudied area. There's a whole psychology and sociology of why people are so poor at attending to this issue. It's a worrisome issue. It's overwhelming. It makes us feel that we might not be doing the right thing as individuals, as groups. But really, that's what needs to happen is, reorienting our organizations, our churches, our schools, our cities, our other ways that we interact with people, and making those conducive for people to act on climate change. Because right now, we are really all avoiding this problem, avoiding dealing with it, and we are going to pay because the impacts, as you say, are phenomenally greater if we act now and very ambitiously, and if we don't. And I wanted to also say that there are great benefits to our acting. That is, we could have a much more equitable society with good employment for a lot of people doing the work of converting our fossil fuel-based economy into one based on renewable energy, on storage, and on a much more diversified set of energy sources than we currently have. And our environment will be much better in the immediate terms in the ways that are being experienced, of course, in China with urban air pollution, but also in the stability of our climate to produce the food that we need, as was just described in Dan's report, and also in addressing heat waves, which are deadly, flooding, which has gotten much worse. And I know China and the United States have faced many floods, hurricanes,
right,
cyclones, potentially famines and refugee crises as people spread across borders, moving out of areas that are becoming uninhabitable because of climate change.
Thank you so much. We do appreciate your insights. Timmons Roberts there, Professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology at Brown University.